While enjoying a quiet dinner with his new wife, a man unexpectedly crosses paths with his stunning ex-wife at the same restaurant. What unfolds next is a gripping tale of unresolved emotions, surprising revelations, and life-changing decisions that will leave you captivated. The restaurant was a picture of sophistication, a perfect choice for a celebratory evening. Clara had spent weeks preparing for this milestone, her latest achievement in business, and tonight was her night to bask in success. Her sleek black dress shimmered under the soft golden glow of the chandeliers, and her radiant smile was as intoxicating as the vintage wine swirling in her glass. Jonathan Carter, her husband of 3 years, sat across from her, his tailored suit a testament to his meticulous nature. Though he was a man of few words, tonight he had been unusually attentive, raising his glass in repeated toasts to Clara's triumphs. It felt like the perfect evening, until it wasn't. Jonathan's laughter faltered mid-sentence. His hand froze, still gripping his wine glass, and his gaze drifted past Clara's shoulder. She turned, following his line of sight, but only saw a cluster of diners engrossed in their meals. When she looked back, Jonathan's expression had turned unreadable, his face a mask of tension. "Jonathan, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Yeah," he replied too quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I thought I recognized someone. It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Jonathan's heart raced as his eyes locked on the figure across the room. There she was, Evelyn, his ex-wife, and she looked stunning. Dressed in a simple but elegant emerald green dress, Evelyn exuded a quiet confidence that made her impossible to ignore. Her hair, now shorter than he remembered, framed her face in soft waves, and the way she carried herself, poised, assured, reminded Jonathan of the woman he had once loved. Seated beside her was a man Jonathan didn't recognize, but the ease of their conversation and the warmth in Evelyn's smile stirred something unfamiliar in him. Jealousy. "Jonathan?" Clara's voice pulled him back to the present. She had tilted her head slightly, studying him with a mix of confusion and curiosity. "Yes?" he said, clearing his throat and taking a sip of water to mask his discomfort. "You're distracted. Who did you think you saw?" He hesitated. "No one important," he lied, averting his gaze. "Just someone I used to know." The answer didn't satisfy Clara, but she let it slide. For now. Jonathan tried to refocus, but the evening had lost its charm. His attention kept wandering back to Evelyn. He couldn't help but replay their history in his mind. The whirlwind romance, the laughter-filled years, and the eventual unraveling of their marriage. He thought he had moved on. After all, he and Clara had built a life together that was stable, even enviable. But the sight of Evelyn, glowing, confident, and in the company of another man was like a punch to the gut. Clara, meanwhile, was growing increasingly uneasy. She could sense the shift in Jonathan's demeanor, even if she couldn't pinpoint its cause. Her husband, usually so composed, was fidgeting with his napkin, his smile forced and fleeting. Clara prided herself on her intuition, and tonight it was telling her that something, or someone, was bothering him. As the server brought their entrees, Clara decided to probe further. "Jonathan," she began, her tone light but probing, "you've been awfully quiet. Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," he insisted, his voice a touch too firm. "Just a bit tired from work." It was an excuse Clara had heard before, but tonight it rang hollow. She nodded, forcing herself to focus on her meal, though her appetite had dimmed. Across the room, Evelyn was equally aware of Jonathan's presence. She had noticed him the moment he entered the restaurant, his familiar silhouette a jarring reminder of a past she had worked hard to leave behind. At first, she thought she was imagining things, but then their eyes met, and there was no denying it. It was him. She felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite name. Not regret exactly, but a bittersweet recognition of what they had once shared. The man beside her, Marcus, noticed her distraction and followed her gaze. "Do you know him?" Marcus asked, his tone casual but curious. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, that's Jonathan, my ex-husband." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The one you told me about?" "Yes," she said simply, returning her attention to her plate. She wasn't ready to unpack the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. Not here, not now. For the rest of the meal, the tension between the two tables was palpable, though unspoken. Jonathan avoided looking in Evelyn's direction, but his thoughts were consumed by her presence. Evelyn, for her part, tried to focus on Marcus, but her mind kept drifting back to Jonathan and the life they had left behind. As the evening wore on, fate seemed to conspire against them. Evelyn and Marcus rose to leave just as Jonathan and Clara were finishing dessert. Their paths crossed near the exit, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Evelyn," Jonathan said, his voice a mix of surprise and something softer. Evelyn turned, her expression composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of emotion. "Jonathan, it's been a while." Clara, sensing the weight of the moment, stepped closer to Jonathan and extended a polite smile. "I'm Clara, Jonathan's wife." Evelyn's smile didn't waver, though her eyes darkened slightly. "It's nice to meet you," she said, her voice steady. "This is Marcus." Introductions were made, pleasantries exchanged, but beneath the surface a storm was brewing. For Jonathan, the encounter had opened a door he wasn't sure he wanted to close. For Evelyn, it was a reminder of wounds that hadn't fully healed. And for Clara, it was the beginning of questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. As Evelyn and Marcus walked out into the night, Clara turned to Jonathan. "So," she said, her voice casual but her eyes sharp, "are you going to tell me about her?" Jonathan hesitated, the weight of the evening settling on his shoulders. "She's my ex-wife," he said finally, "but it's a long story." "Well," Clara replied, her voice tinged with an edge, "we've got time." And just like that, the perfect evening was left in fragments, overshadowed by the unspoken truths that had come rushing back to the surface. Jonathan hesitated as Clara's question hung in the air. The word ex-wife felt heavier than it should, its implications unspoken, but clear. He had been so focused on moving forward with Clara that he hadn't thought about Evelyn in years. Not like this, anyway. And yet, seeing her tonight had shaken something loose, memories tumbling out like water breaching a dam. Clara, meanwhile, wasn't about to let the matter drop. "Jonathan," she said, her voice firmer now, "I want to understand. Who is she to you?" He met her gaze, seeing the mix of curiosity and concern in her eyes. This was the woman he had chosen to share his life with, the woman who deserved his honesty. And yet, explaining Evelyn felt like opening a door to a part of himself he wasn't sure Clara would understand. "She was my wife," he said, his voice measured. "Before I met you, before everything changed." Clara arched an eyebrow. "That much I gathered. What I want to know is why you reacted the way you did. You've been distracted ever since you saw her. Why?" Jonathan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "It's complicated." Clara tilted her head. "Isn't it always?" He couldn't help but smile at her sharp wit, even as he struggled to find the right words. "Evelyn and I were married for 5 years. We met when we were both young and ambitious. She was a journalist, and I was just starting to make my mark in real estate. We fell fast and hard, one of those whirlwind romances that feel like they'll last forever." Clara listened intently, her expression unreadable. "What happened?" Jonathan hesitated, the memories tugging at him like old wounds. "Life happened. We were both so focused on our careers that we started to drift apart. I was working long hours, traveling constantly, and she was chasing stories halfway around the world. We stopped communicating, stopped trying." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "And then there was an argument, a big one. She wanted to start a family and I wasn't ready. I thought we had time, that we could wait until everything was perfect. But she didn't see it that way. She thought I was avoiding it because I didn't want the same life she did." Clara leaned forward slightly. "And was she right?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Maybe. At the time I thought I was being practical, but looking back, I don't know. We both made mistakes and eventually the cracks turned into a chasm. We divorced and she moved away. That was the last I saw of her. Until tonight." Clara absorbed his words, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "And seeing her now, after all these years, it caught me off guard," Jonathan admitted. "I didn't expect to feel anything. But seeing her, looking so different, it brought back memories I hadn't thought about in a long time." "Different how?" Clara's tone was casual, but there was a hint of something beneath it, an edge, a question she wasn't quite asking. Jonathan hesitated. "She looked happy, confident, like she had found a part of herself that was missing when we were together." Clara's lips tightened, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and half-formed thoughts. Do you regret it? Clara asked finally, her voice quiet. Jonathan looked at her, startled. Regret what? Letting her go. Do you regret losing her? The question hit him like a sucker punch. Did he regret it? He thought about the years he had spent building his career, the sacrifices he had made, and the man he had become. He thought about the moments he had shared with Evelyn, the laughter, the arguments, the love that had once felt unbreakable. And then he thought about Clara, steady, supportive, and fiercely intelligent. No, he said at last. I don't regret it. Our marriage ended for a reason, and I've moved on. I'm happy with you, Clara. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read between the lines of his answer. Good, she said, her voice cool. Because I don't share. Jonathan reached across the table to take her hand. You don't have to. Evelyn is my past, but you're my present, and my future. Clara smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She squeezed his hand, then released it, signaling the end of the conversation. For now. As Clara and Jonathan navigated their strained conversation, Evelyn remained across the restaurant, oblivious to the ripples her presence was causing. She was seated at a modest table by the window, her attention focused on the man across from her. He was sharply dressed, with an air of quiet confidence that matched her own composed demeanor. The two appeared engrossed in their conversation, their body language relaxed but tinged with intensity. Jonathan's eyes drifted back to Evelyn periodically, despite himself. Who was the man she was with? A friend? A colleague? Or perhaps someone more significant? He couldn't shake the curiosity, nor the faint, inexplicable twinge of something that felt suspiciously like jealousy. Clara noticed, of course. She leaned in slightly, her voice low and clipped. You're staring, Jonathan. He blinked, pulling himself back to the present. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Didn't you? Clara's tone was sharper now, her patience wearing thin. Because it's starting to feel like this dinner has 3 people at the table. Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Evelyn stood up. She excused herself from her table, leaving her companion momentarily alone, and made her way toward the exit. Jonathan tensed, torn between staying seated and acting on the impulse that was building within him. Clara must have sensed it because she placed a hand on his arm. Don't even think about it, she warned. But it was too late. Jonathan had already pushed back his chair, muttering something about needing a moment, and followed Evelyn toward the front of the restaurant. Clara's expression darkened, but she stayed put, deciding to let him hang himself with his own choices. As Evelyn stepped outside, the cool night air greeted her. She paused, inhaling deeply, the quiet a welcome contrast to the bustling restaurant. Jonathan approached her hesitantly, his footsteps muffled on the cobblestone path. Evelyn, he called softly. She turned, surprise flashing across her face before it was quickly replaced by a guarded expression. Jonathan. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years that had passed since their last conversation hung between them like an invisible barrier. I didn't mean to interrupt, Jonathan began, his voice tinged with unease. I saw you and I felt like I needed to say something. Evelyn crossed her arms, her posture defensive. What could you possibly need to say after all this time? Jonathan hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't know. Seeing you tonight, it brought back memories. Good ones, mostly. Evelyn's gaze hardened. Good ones? That's surprising, considering how things ended. He flinched, her words cutting deeper than he expected. You're right. I wasn't a good husband to you, Evelyn. I made mistakes, big ones, and I've regretted them. Regret? She repeated, her tone incredulous. Regret doesn't undo the years I spent trying to hold us together while you prioritized everything but me. Regret doesn't erase the nights I cried myself to sleep wondering why I wasn't enough for you. Her words hit him like a blow, each syllable a reminder of the damage he had done. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know that doesn't change anything, but I am. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she sighed and softened, just slightly. Jonathan, I've moved on. You should too. Is that man you're with? He stopped himself, realizing how intrusive the question sounded, but the look in her eyes confirmed what he already suspected. Yes, Evelyn said simply. His name is Andrew. He's kind, thoughtful, and he makes me feel like I matter. Jonathan swallowed hard, the truth of her words stinging more than he cared to admit. I'm glad, he said, and for once he meant it. You deserve that. Evelyn nodded, her expression softening further. Thank you. And for what it's worth, I hope you find the same. Someone who makes you happy. Jonathan nodded, watching as she turned and walked back into the restaurant, leaving him alone in the night. For the first time, he realized that his past with Evelyn wasn't something he could change or fix. It was something he would have to learn to accept and let go of. When he returned to his table, Clara was waiting, her arms crossed and her expression frosty. "Well?" she asked. "She's happy," Jonathan said simply, sitting down and picking up his glass of wine. "And that's all that matters." Clara studied him for a moment, then leaned back in her chair, her lips pursed. "Good," she said finally, though the tension between them remained. As Evelyn re-entered the restaurant, she took a moment to steady herself. Running into Jonathan had been unexpected, and though she had kept her composure, the encounter left her shaken. Memories she had worked so hard to bury were now rising unbidden, threatening to overshadow the life she had built for herself. She returned to her table where Andrew, her current partner, was patiently waiting. He looked up, concern flashing across his face as she sat down. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. Evelyn forced a smile. "Just needed some air," she replied, taking a sip of water to mask her unease. Andrew didn't push further, respecting her boundaries as he always did. It was one of the many things she appreciated about him, his ability to give her space when she needed it. Still, the encounter with Jonathan lingered in her mind, and Andrew's perceptive nature didn't miss the way her gaze occasionally flickered toward the other side of the room. Evelyn couldn't help but glance at Jonathan and Clara's table. She noticed the tension in their body language, Clara's stiff posture, and Jonathan's downcast expression. It reminded her of the countless dinners she had endured with Jonathan during the later years of their marriage, where their silences were louder than any argument. She returned her focus to Andrew, determined not to let her past overshadow her present. But Andrew, ever observant, leaned in slightly. "You've been quiet since we got here. Did something happen?" Evelyn hesitated. She had been open with Andrew about her previous marriage, but she hadn't shared every detail. The wounds were still tender, even after all these years. "I ran into someone," she admitted finally, her voice steady. "Someone I didn't expect to see." Andrew's brows furrowed slightly, his concern deepening. "An old friend?" "No," Evelyn replied, meeting his gaze. "My ex-husband." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Andrew's expression didn't change much. He was careful not to react strongly, but she could see the flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I see," he said slowly, sitting back in his chair. "And how do you feel about that?" Evelyn appreciated Andrew's patience and his willingness to let her process things in her own time. She considered her answer carefully before speaking. "It's complicated," she admitted. "Seeing him brought back memories, some good but mostly bad. I didn't expect it to affect me as much as it has." Andrew nodded thoughtfully. "It's understandable. The past has a way of sneaking up on us when we least expect it." Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude for Andrew's understanding. He didn't pry or judge. He simply offered her a safe space to share what she wanted. It was a stark contrast to her relationship with Jonathan, where she had often felt scrutinized and criticized. "Thank you," she said softly, placing her hand over his, "for understanding." Andrew smiled warmly, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here for you. Always." Despite Andrew's reassurance, Evelyn couldn't shake the memories that had resurfaced. She thought about the early days of her marriage to Jonathan, when everything had seemed perfect. He had been attentive, loving, and ambitious. She had believed they were building a life together, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared dreams. But as Jonathan's career took off, their relationship began to falter. His priorities shifted, and she often felt like an afterthought in his world. Late nights at the office, missed anniversaries, and his growing detachment created a chasm between them that she didn't know how to bridge. The final straw had been his infidelity. Evelyn had discovered it by accident, an errant text message that left little room for doubt. Confronting him had been one of the most painful moments of her life. He had tried to downplay it, to brush it off as a mistake, but the damage was done. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Leaving Jonathan had been both the hardest and the best decision Evelyn had ever made. It had taken years to rebuild her life, to rediscover her sense of self-worth and independence. Meeting Andrew had been a turning point, a reminder that love didn't have to be a battlefield. Evelyn looked across the table at Andrew, feeling a surge of gratitude for the man he was. He had shown her what a healthy, supportive relationship could look like. She didn't need Jonathan's validation or closure anymore. She had created her own. As the evening wore on, Evelyn allowed herself to relax, focusing on the present rather than the past. Andrew's laughter and the easy flow of their conversation reminded her of how far she had come. But even as she smiled and laughed, she couldn't help but wonder, had Jonathan truly changed, or was he still the man she had walked away from? And why did it matter to her now, after all this time? As Jonathan sat across from Clara, the tension between them was palpable. The meal had gone cold, and the initial charm of the evening had long since evaporated. Clara's expression was a mixture of disbelief and frustration as she stared at Jonathan, her fork idly pushing around a piece of roasted vegetable. "Jonathan," she said finally, her voice cutting through the awkward silence, "you've been acting strange all night. Are you going to tell me what's going on, or do I have to guess?" Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew he couldn't evade her questions any longer. The encounter with Evelyn had rattled him more than he cared to admit, and Clara wasn't the type to let things slide. "It's nothing," he said weakly, avoiding her gaze. Clara's eyes narrowed. "Nothing. You've been staring at that woman, your ex-wife, for the better part of the evening. Don't insult my intelligence, Jonathan. If this is going to work, you need to be honest with me." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Clara was right. He owed her honesty, even if the truth wasn't easy to articulate. He took a deep breath and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Evelyn," he began, his voice hesitant, "was a big part of my life. Seeing her here tonight, it caught me off guard." Clara crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "And? Is that all? Or is there more you're not telling me?" Jonathan hesitated. He didn't know how to explain the whirlwind of emotions that had resurfaced since seeing Evelyn. Guilt, regret, nostalgia, they all collided in a way that left him feeling unmoored. "We didn't end things well," he admitted finally. "I made mistakes, big ones. Seeing her here tonight brought all of that back." Clara raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "Mistakes? Like what? Cheating? Lying?" Jonathan looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. "Yes," he said softly. "I hurt her in ways I'm not proud of." Clara let out a sharp breath, her frustration evident. "And now what? Are you saying you still have feelings for her? That you want to fix things with her?" "No," Jonathan said quickly, shaking his head. "That's not what I'm saying. I don't know. Seeing her reminded me of who I used to be, of how much I've changed, or tried to change." Clara's gaze softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "Jonathan, everyone has a past. I get that. But if you're not over her, if she still has this kind of power over you, then we have a problem." Jonathan looked up at her, his expression earnest. "I'm not trying to rekindle anything with Evelyn. I'm with you, Clara. But seeing her made me realize how much I've hurt people in my life. It's not about wanting her back. It's about wanting to be better for you, for us." Clara studied him for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she spoke. "I appreciate your honesty, Jonathan, but you need to figure out what you want and you need to be sure. I won't play second fiddle to a ghost from your past." Her words stung, but Jonathan knew they came from a place of self-respect. Clara wasn't someone who would settle for less than she deserved, and he admired that about her. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that his unresolved issues with Evelyn were a barrier to the life he was trying to build with Clara. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. With you, with myself, with everyone I've hurt." Clara nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Then start by being honest with yourself, Jonathan. You can't move forward if you're still holding on to the past." As the evening wore on, their conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Jonathan knew he had a lot of work to do, not just to mend things with Clara, but to reconcile the man he was with the man he wanted to become. For now, all he could do was take it one step at a time. As Evelyn cleared the last table of the night, the quiet hum of the restaurant offered her a rare moment of stillness. Her hands moved mechanically, gathering plates and wiping surfaces, but her mind was elsewhere. The unexpected encounter with Jonathan had left her shaken, unearthing memories she thought she had buried long ago. Evelyn leaned against the counter, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the glass panel above. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The vibrant, ambitious version of herself that Jonathan had once known felt like a distant memory, replaced by someone who had learned resilience through hardship. She thought back to the years they had spent together. Their marriage had started with so much promise. Jonathan, with his boundless charm and vision, had swept her off her feet. She had fallen in love with his ambition, believing that together they could conquer the world. But as his career took off, the cracks in their relationship began to show. His long hours at work turned into late-night meetings, and his promises of quality time dissolved into empty apologies. Evelyn had tried to hold it all together, supporting him through his professional pursuits while sacrificing her own dreams. She had hoped that her unwavering loyalty would bring them closer, but instead, it seemed to drive them apart. She closed her eyes, replaying the day she had discovered Jonathan's betrayal. The memory was as vivid as ever. The phone call from a friend, the proof she couldn't ignore, and the devastating confrontation that followed. Evelyn had poured her heart out, demanding answers, but Jonathan's excuses only deepened the chasm between them. In the end, it wasn't just the infidelity that had broken her. It was the realization that she had lost herself in their relationship, sacrificing her identity for a man who didn't see her worth. The divorce, though painful, had been a turning point. It forced her to confront her fears and rebuild her life from the ground up. And now, here he was again, sitting in her section with another woman by his side. Evelyn couldn't deny the pang of jealousy that had crept in when she saw them together. Clara was everything Evelyn had once been, poised, confident, and clearly adored by Jonathan. But she reminded herself that appearances could be deceiving. She had been in Clara's shoes once, and she knew how quickly the illusion could shatter. Evelyn exhaled deeply, willing herself to focus on the present. She had worked hard to create a stable life for herself, even if it wasn't the glamorous existence she had once imagined. The restaurant job wasn't ideal, but it paid the bills and allowed her to save for the future. Her independence, hard-won and fiercely protected, was something she refused to compromise. Still, seeing Jonathan had stirred something within her, a mixture of anger, sadness, and a lingering sense of unfinished business. She wondered if he felt the same way. His presence in the restaurant tonight hadn't felt coincidental, and the way he had looked at her carried a weight that spoke volumes. But what did he want? An apology? Closure? Or something more? Her thoughts were interrupted by her coworker Mia, who approached with a sympathetic smile. "You okay? You've been quiet all night." Evelyn nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." Mia tilted her head, studying her. "It's because of that guy earlier, isn't it? The one who couldn't take his eyes off you." Evelyn's cheeks flushed. "It's complicated." Mia leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Well, if you ask me, he looked like a man with regrets. And that woman with him? She didn't seem too happy about the situation either." Evelyn frowned, unsure how to respond. She appreciated Mia's observation, but it only added to the swirl of emotions she was already grappling with. "Thanks, Mia," she said softly. "But I think it's better if I just focus on the future. The past doesn't have anything new to say." Mia nodded, sensing Evelyn's need for space. "Fair enough, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here." As Evelyn finished her shift and stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The encounter with Jonathan had opened old wounds, but it had also reminded her of how far she had come. She wasn't the same woman who had walked away from that marriage. She was stronger now, and she refused to let her past define her. Even so, she couldn't help but wonder if her story with Jonathan was truly over, or if this unexpected reunion was the beginning of something she had yet to understand. Jonathan sat in his sleek minimalist office the next morning, his gaze fixed on the panoramic view of the city. Normally, the bustling skyline energized him, a reminder of all he had accomplished, but today it felt oppressive. His thoughts were consumed by the events of the previous evening. Seeing Evelyn again had been like a punch to the gut. She was both familiar and unfamiliar, a living reminder of the life he had once shared and squandered. He had anticipated that running into her might be awkward, but nothing could have prepared him for the tidal wave of emotions it unleashed. And then there was Clara. She had spent the entire evening trying to pull him back into the moment, her polite laughter a thin veil for her growing frustration. Jonathan couldn't blame her. He had been distant, distracted and clearly unprepared for the confrontation with his past. Clara deserved better, but so had Evelyn, and he had failed her too. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as memories from his marriage flooded back. He had loved Evelyn deeply. Of that he was certain. She had been his anchor, the one person who believed in him even when he doubted himself. But somewhere along the way, he had let his ambition consume him. He became so focused on climbing the ladder of success that he lost sight of the people who mattered most. Evelyn had been patient, far more patient than he deserved. She had stood by him through long nights at the office, missed anniversaries, and countless broken promises. But her patience had limits, and when he betrayed her trust, she had every right to leave. He didn't fight her decision, too ashamed to admit how much he had hurt her, and too proud to ask for forgiveness. Now, years later, he was left to face the consequences of his choices. Seeing Evelyn working at that restaurant, carrying herself with quiet dignity despite the circumstances, had ignited a fire in him. He couldn't ignore the guilt that gnawed at him, nor could he deny the lingering feelings he still had for her. But what could he do? Apologies felt hollow, and he doubted Evelyn would welcome any overtures from him. She had made it clear that their chapter was closed, and he couldn't blame her for wanting to keep it that way. Still, the idea of walking away again felt unbearable. Jonathan's phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Clara. "We need to talk. Call me when you have time." He sighed, dreading the inevitable conversation. Clara was perceptive. She had undoubtedly picked up on his preoccupation with Evelyn. She deserved an explanation, but Jonathan wasn't sure he could give her the one she wanted. He picked up the phone and dialed her number. Clara answered almost immediately. "Jonathan," she said, her tone brisk but tinged with emotion. "I think we both know there's something we need to address." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "I know, Clara. I owe you an explanation." "Yes, you do," she said, not giving him an inch of reprieve. "Last night, it was like you weren't even there, and it didn't take much to figure out why." Jonathan took a deep breath. "You're right. Seeing Evelyn again, it stirred up things I thought I had buried. I didn't handle it well, and I'm sorry for how that affected you." Clara was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer but no less resolute. "Jonathan, I need to know where your heart is. Is it still with her?" He hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "Clara, I care about you. You've been an incredible partner, and I don't want to diminish what we've built together. But seeing Evelyn reminded me of unfinished business, of mistakes I never truly addressed. I can't give you the clarity you deserve right now, and that's not fair to you." Clara sighed, her voice heavy with disappointment. "At least you're honest. But Jonathan, I won't wait around while you figure this out. I deserve someone who's all in." "I know," he said quietly, "and you do. I'm sorry." The call ended, leaving Jonathan feeling both relieved and hollow. Clara's departure was yet another casualty of his inability to let go of the past, but it was a necessary one. He couldn't continue to lead her on when his heart was so clearly tied to another. Later that afternoon, Jonathan found himself parked outside the restaurant. He hadn't intended to come, but his subconscious had led him there. He watched as Evelyn moved through the dining room, her movements deliberate and graceful despite the weight he knew she carried. For the first time, he saw her not as his ex-wife or a relic of his past, but as a woman who had endured more than he could imagine and emerged stronger. He wanted to be part of her life again, not to rekindle old flames or assuage his guilt, but to support her in whatever way she would allow. Jonathan stepped out of the car, his resolve firm. He didn't know how Evelyn would react, but he was ready to find out. Jonathan entered the restaurant with measured steps, his heart pounding in his chest. The lunchtime rush was in full swing, and the hum of conversation filled the air. The sight of Evelyn moving effortlessly between tables, a calm smile on her face, both soothed and unnerved him. She looked so different yet so achingly familiar. Evelyn noticed him almost immediately. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she steadied herself, adopting a professional demeanor. She approached him with cautious curiosity. "Jonathan," she greeted, her tone polite but guarded. "I didn't expect to see you here again so soon." Jonathan hesitated, searching for the right words. "I needed to talk to you, properly, not in the way we did last night." Evelyn crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "I'm working, Jonathan. If this is about the past, I've made my peace with it. This isn't just about the past, he replied, his voice soft but earnest. I want to understand how you got here, how we got here, and if there's any way I can help. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. Help? Jonathan, I don't need your charity. It's not charity, he said quickly. It's guilt, maybe. Regret, definitely. But more than that, it's about trying to do the right thing, even if I'm years too late. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Before she could respond, her manager appeared, a tall man with an impatient expression. Evelyn, he said sharply, you're on the clock. If you're going to chat with your friend here, do it after your shift. Jonathan immediately stepped forward. I won't keep her long. I'll wait until she's done. The manager looked between the two of them, his irritation evident, before walking away, muttering under his breath. Evelyn sighed, brushing her hair back from her face. Fine. I get off in an hour. If you're serious about talking, wait outside. But don't expect much. Jonathan sat in his car, staring at the dashboard as the minutes dragged by. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish with this conversation. He had no grand plan, no perfect words to make things right. All he knew was that he couldn't keep walking away. When Evelyn finally emerged from the restaurant, she looked exhausted but determined. She gestured toward a nearby bench, and they sat down together, a chasm of unspoken history between them. I'll give you 5 minutes, she said, crossing her arms. Say what you came to say. Jonathan nodded, taking a deep breath. I saw you last night, Evelyn, and it shook me. I've spent so many years burying what happened between us, convincing myself that moving on was the best thing for both of us. But seeing you again made me realize how much I failed you, and how much I failed myself. Evelyn's expression remained guarded, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. Jonathan, we've both moved on. I don't need you to dig up the past just to soothe your guilt. This isn't just about guilt, he said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. It's about recognizing that I made mistakes I never tried to fix. You deserved better, Evelyn. And seeing you working so hard, knowing what you're carrying, I can't stand by and do nothing. She glanced away, her jaw tightening. You don't get to swoop in and play the hero, Jonathan. I've built my life without you. I've faced every challenge alone, and I've survived. I don't need you to save me. I'm not trying to save you, he said earnestly. I just want to help. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm willing to listen. Tell me what you need, and I'll do my best to provide it. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes blazing. What I needed was for you to be there years ago, to be my partner, my support, instead of the man who tore everything apart. Jonathan nodded, absorbing the sting of her words. I know, and I can't change the past, but if there's any way I can make things even a fraction better now, I'll do it. For a moment, Evelyn said nothing. Then, to his surprise, her posture softened slightly. If you're serious about helping, there's one thing you can do. Anything, he said immediately. She looked him in the eye, her expression resolute. Respect my boundaries. Don't come into my life expecting forgiveness or redemption. If you want to help, do it without expecting anything in return. Jonathan swallowed hard, nodding. I can do that. Evelyn stood, brushing off her hands. Then start by leaving me alone for now. I'll let you know if I need anything. As she walked away, Jonathan felt a strange mix of relief and heartbreak. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was a start. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally moving in the right direction. Weeks passed, and Jonathan honored Evelyn's request to keep his distance. Despite his initial impulse to push for more interaction, he restrained himself, focusing instead on what she had asked, helping without intruding. He discreetly arranged for anonymous assistance, a grocery delivery here, a small financial contribution to her restaurant manager to cover her medical leave there, but he made sure Evelyn remained unaware of his involvement. Evelyn, meanwhile, continued to navigate the challenges of her pregnancy and work. The baby was due in a few months, and while she managed her responsibilities with characteristic resilience, she couldn't deny the toll it was taking. Her colleagues noticed her occasional fatigue and slower movements, but she rarely complained. Amanda, her closest friend at the restaurant, finally confronted her during a quiet moment. Evelyn, you've been pushing yourself too hard. You need to take a break. I can't afford a break, Evelyn replied, brushing off the concern. Besides, I've got this. Amanda sighed, folding her arms. You've got a baby on the way. You shouldn't be working double shifts. What about that ex of yours? Has he really disappeared? Evelyn hesitated, biting her lip. Jonathan hasn't shown up since we talked. He's respecting my boundaries. And the baby's father, Amanda pressed. Evelyn shook her head. That's complicated. Amanda gave her a pointed look. Complicated or not, you're not doing this alone anymore. You've got me for starters. Evelyn managed a small smile, touched by Amanda's loyalty. Thanks, Amanda. I mean it. Across town, Jonathan was wrestling with his own emotions. Despite staying away, he couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn, the memories of their time together, the mistakes he had made, and the unspoken connection he still felt consumed him. He threw himself into his work as a distraction, but even the most demanding projects failed to hold his attention for long. One evening, he found himself driving aimlessly through the city. He wasn't sure where he was going until he realized he was nearing Evelyn's neighborhood. He parked a few blocks away, feeling conflicted. Was he crossing a line by being there? But he needed to see her, even from a distance, to reassure himself that she was okay. As he walked past the restaurant, he caught sight of her inside. She was sitting at a booth with Amanda, her hands resting protectively on her growing belly. She looked tired but peaceful, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the restaurant lights. Jonathan stayed outside, watching through the window. He didn't approach, didn't try to catch her attention. For the first time, he was content just to observe, to know she was safe. A few days later, Evelyn received a call from her landlord about a sudden rent adjustment. Ms. Blake, I wanted to inform you that your rent has been partially covered for the next 3 months, the landlord said. Evelyn was stunned. What? Who? It was anonymous, the landlord replied. But it seems like someone wanted to make things easier for you. Evelyn's first thought was Jonathan, but she quickly dismissed it. He had promised to stay out of her life unless she asked for help. Could it have been Amanda, or someone else entirely? The gesture left her conflicted. While she was grateful for the relief, she hated the idea of relying on anyone, especially Jonathan. Her independence had been hard-won, and she wasn't ready to give it up. That evening, as she lay in bed, Evelyn found herself thinking about Jonathan's last words to her. He had seemed so sincere, so different from the man she had once known. But could she trust that change was real? Could she risk letting him back into her life, even at arm's length? Meanwhile, Jonathan had his own doubts. His attempts to help anonymously felt hollow without Evelyn's acknowledgement. He didn't want gratitude. He wanted to show her that he could be better, that he had grown. But how could he do that without overstepping? One day he received a call from Amanda. The unexpected contact startled him. Jonathan, it's Amanda. I work with Evelyn. I know who you are, he replied, his heart racing. Is everything okay? Not exactly, Amanda said. Look, I'm not calling to play matchmaker, but Evelyn's been struggling. She won't admit it, but she's overworking herself, and it's taking a toll. If you really want to help, now's the time. Jonathan didn't hesitate. Tell me what she needs, I'll handle it. Amanda sighed. She needs rest. She needs someone to step up and take some of the weight off her shoulders. But if you're going to do this, you'd better mean it. No half measures. Jonathan's voice was firm. I won't let her down. Amanda's silence on the other end spoke volumes before she finally said, All right, I'll let you know when you can step in without her shutting you out. The next few days marked a turning point. Amanda subtly paved the way for Jonathan's re-entry into Evelyn's life, starting with small gestures. She mentioned to Evelyn that someone was willing to offer support without expecting anything in return, carefully omitting Jonathan's involvement. At first, Evelyn resisted. I don't need anyone swooping in to fix my life, she said firmly. Maybe not, Amanda replied. But you deserve a little help, Evelyn. Just think about it. Evelyn did think about it long and hard, and as her due date approached, she realized that accepting help didn't mean losing her independence. It meant giving her child the best possible start. Evelyn decided to accept the help offered, albeit reluctantly. She didn't know the full extent of who was behind the support or the lengths they were going to, but something in Amanda's words had struck a chord. For the sake of her baby, she allowed herself to lean on someone else, just this once. Jonathan, meanwhile, coordinated with Amanda to ensure his efforts wouldn't overwhelm Evelyn. He arranged for professional cleaning services to tidy her apartment, stocked her fridge with healthy meals, and even hired a doula to provide guidance and support during the final stages of her pregnancy. Evelyn was suspicious of the sudden changes, but appreciated the relief they brought. Amanda, who's behind all of this? She asked one day. eyeing the groceries and neatly folded laundry with a mix of gratitude and suspicion. Amanda hesitated, knowing the moment of truth was near. Does it matter, Evelyn? Whoever it is, they're doing this because they care. Evelyn frowned, not entirely convinced. I just don't like not knowing. You will, Amanda said softly, when the time is right. The time came sooner than Evelyn expected. One evening, as she sat in her living room folding baby clothes, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Jonathan standing there, holding a small bundle of baby essentials. Her immediate reaction was surprise, followed by a flicker of anger. You? She said, crossing her arms. You're the one behind all this? Jonathan set the bundle down gently, meeting her gaze with calm sincerity. I didn't want to overwhelm you, Evelyn. I just wanted to help, but I didn't want you to feel pressured. She hesitated, her emotions swirling. Why now, Jonathan? Why after everything? He took a deep breath. Because I realized how wrong I was. About us. About everything. I don't expect you to forgive me or even to trust me, but I want to do right by you and the baby. Not for my own peace of mind, but because it's the least I owe you. Evelyn studied him for a long moment. His words felt genuine, but she had learned not to trust easily. This doesn't change the past, she said finally. I know, he replied, and I'm not asking for that. I just want to be here, in whatever way you'll let me. Jonathan's persistence began to wear down Evelyn's walls. Slowly but surely, she allowed him into her life, starting with small steps. He accompanied her to a few doctor's appointments, where he marveled at the sight of their baby on the ultrasound screen. He was there when she finalized the nursery, painting the walls and assembling the crib, with an attention to detail that surprised her. As the weeks went on, Evelyn began to see a different side of Jonathan. He wasn't the man she remembered, arrogant, self-centered, and dismissive. This Jonathan was patient, considerate, and willing to listen. He showed up not with grand gestures, but with quiet consistency, proving through actions rather than words that he had changed. The night Evelyn went into labor, Jonathan was by her side. He held her hand through every contraction, his face a mixture of awe and fear. You've got this, he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. You're the strongest person I know. Hours later, the cries of their newborn daughter filled the room. Evelyn held the baby first, tears streaming down her face as she gazed at the tiny life she had brought into the world. When she passed the baby to Jonathan, his hands shook as he cradled his daughter for the first time. She's perfect, he whispered, his voice breaking. Just like her mother. Evelyn looked at him, her heart softening in ways she hadn't thought possible. Jonathan, this doesn't mean… I know, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just grateful to be here. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan continued to be a constant presence. He helped with late-night feedings, diaper changes, and the endless laundry that came with a newborn. He never overstepped, always letting Evelyn set the boundaries. Slowly, she began to trust him again. One evening, as they sat in the living room with their sleeping daughter between them, Evelyn finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her. You've changed, Jonathan. I can see that. And I'm willing to give you a chance, not for us, but for her. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Evelyn. I promise I won't let you down. The road ahead wasn't easy, but they were willing to take it one step at a time. Together, they began to rebuild a relationship not based on the past, but on the hope of a better future, for themselves and their daughter. And in that quiet, imperfect new beginning, they found something they never expected: redemption, love, and a second chance at happiness. If this heartfelt story resonated with you, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more emotional tales like this one. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next story.